Hello and welcome to Coping with COVID, Building Resilience, a new podcast with me, Leyla Josephine and Anne McKechnie. We'll be discussing how COVID-19 affects our mental health and some tips on how to cope with these unusual times. I'm a performance poet and theatre maker who works in lots of different social contexts, and Anne is a forensic clinical psychologist who specialises in trauma. She believes that sharing knowledge about mental health is important for everyone. It's these expertise that we will be using to get into the heart of what's happening now and looking to the future. Hi, Anne.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good, actually. Enjoying the nice weather.
Good. Is it nice where you are? It's so grey where I am.
It's today, but I think it's to turn tomorrow. We've been really fortunate with the weather so far, but I think it's going to get cold and wet and miserable over the next few days.
I've got this kind of idea that when things go back to normal, it is going to be much more miserable. I think that that's just Scotland's law, isn't it? That when we're in lockdown, it's going to be blue skies, and then when we're finally allowed out, that it'll be grey and raining.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when you were doing exams at school and the weather was always great, and the minute you finished, it turned horrible.
Yeah, that is true. That always does happen. So we are kind of starting to look forward to getting out of lockdown and life returning to some sort of normal. Maybe not the normal that we once had, but definitely more people going back to work, maybe people going back to school. And I think that brings up quite a lot of anxieties for people. It definitely brings up anxiety for me, thinking about how to, interact with groups again. I think that that's going to be a really strange thing to have to do. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Like what's going to happen with our mental health when our new normal is shifting again?
Yeah, well, we are bound to feel anxious. It's inevitable. It's been drummed into us for the last several months about how dangerous this virus is. We don't have a vaccine. It doesn't look like we're going to have a vaccine for a while. So we're going to have to live with this level of anxiety and work our way around it. So I think if people are feeling anxious about it, if they're feeling that they might want to avoid it, that is perfectly normal. But avoidance isn't a good way of tackling difficulties. It's avoidance and lack of acknowledgement of the anxiety. And what we avoid a lot of the time is these horrible feelings. So we decide not to do things because the feelings of feeling anxious or sad or irritable and angry are feelings that we don't like having. So we avoid situations that lead to the anxiety. So what we need to do is to be careful that we're not avoiding that. So I suppose in the lead up to lockdown, it's almost about we start shifting our tolerance already. So if we've been told that we can go out more and we're still avoiding doing that, we help ourselves to go out more. If we have been avoiding going to shops, obviously if you're in a sheltered group, you can't do that. But if you've been avoiding going to shops because actually you make me feel too anxious, then start setting yourself small goals. In a clinical setting, if I'm treating somebody who's, say, agoraphobic or spider-phobic, what we do is what we call graded exposure. So you start off with situations that are mildly anxiety-provoking. And you help people to master their feelings of anxiety, to acknowledge it, to understand where it's coming from, and to learn to control it by gradually introducing larger and larger stressors. Yeah. So what people could be doing is they could be going out to the shop where they haven't been going before. They might go to a shop they haven't been to before. So, a lot of us go to, say, the same supermarket because we know exactly how the aisles are set out. So perhaps changing to a slightly different supermarket. So you're having to cope with a different stress. So doing that, and all about building up our anxiety. The other thing that we really need is certainty. Now, hopefully we'll be getting some of that. At the moment, we're all very, very anxious because it's lots of what ifs. When will I be able to see my son again? What if we can't do Christmas? What if I can't go on holiday for the next 2 years? What if I can't go back to work? What if I don't have a job to go back to? It's these what ifs that make people particularly anxious. So the thing to do with that is to actually give yourself space for the what ifs. Get yourself a what if notebook. So you write down all the what ifs, you limit your time on thinking about that, because if people say, no point in thinking about that, just put it out of your mind. It's a lovely analogy that's used a lot with people, which is, I want you to think about a big, white, fluffy rabbit. 6 foot tall, ears that are 3 foot long, pink lined ears, black nose, huge, big, fluffy bunny rabbit. Now I want you to get that image very firmly in your head.
Yeah.
And now I want you to stop thinking about it. What happens?
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. So when people have lots of what if anxiety worries, and often these can spiral out of control, people can start ruminating, they can start thinking over and over and over again. And the what if scenario becomes bigger and more overwhelming. There's no point in saying to people, just don't think about it. What we say to people is, right, okay, get yourself a what if notebook, write down your worries. Give yourself 5 minutes to just write them down. If you don't want to write, speak into something, share them with somebody, but limit the amount of time that you do that. And then put that away, fold it away, put it away somewhere, and get back on with your life. If you find those what if worries creeping in again, say to yourself, right, okay, I'm going to give myself 5 minutes at 4 o'clock this afternoon to go to my what if notebook and write it all down. So to actually give a bit of space, but then go back to the things over which we have control. So I might not have control over what's going to happen and how we're going to come out of COVID, but I know I can do this. So take each step at a time, and each step that you're allowed, accept it's going to be difficult, but approach it and think, right, this is going to be difficult. So if I think it gets too overwhelming, I'll break it down to small steps. So if, for example, you have completely avoided the supermarket during lockdown. Again, if you're sheltered, this doesn't apply. But if you have completely avoided it, what you do is you might even just go to the supermarket and stand and look at the queue. Do that for a few days until you feel more comfortable. Then you might actually decide to go in the queue and stop when you get to the front of the queue and actually then leave. You might decide to go in and just buy one item and leave. So it's building up your tolerance, building that.
Yeah.
Also, it's accepting that while this adjusting to this new bubble and living in our bubble is being exhausting, it's going to also be exhausting coming out. And some people may have found this period actually okay. But then they get anxious about moving out again. So they might think, oh, I'll manage this, absolutely no problem. I've managed coming into lockdown fine, but actually they might find it difficult to come out again.
Yeah. And I think there's a difference between coming out and also going back to work. I think, yourself, if you've been on holiday or whatever and you sit down at your emails, it can feel like the most overwhelming thing ever. Never mind that if you have been on furlough or, you've not been working in an office, the idea of actually going there and starting something, you're worried that your brain's not going to work.
Absolutely. I've had lots of colleagues telling me that actually, particularly people who've worked in a capacity where there's lots of face-to-face contact, they're worried about losing skills. So again, it's about how do you rebuild your confidence in those skills. So that's about doing things in small, manageable chunks. So that for employers, that might be about talking about phased return. It might be about
and flexibility as well. Yeah,
absolutely, Leyla. So having, allowing people to work shorter hours, allowing people to actually have more breaks, allowing implementing some of those more psychologically aware techniques, like having information lying around that talks about the fact that people may be feeling anxious, down, exhausted, tired, unhappy about going back to work, having information where that acknowledges that. So making space for that, and making space for that at all levels. As we've said before, it's about all levels of an organisation knowing that and acknowledging that.
And I think if I lived in like a kind of big city like London or, Glasgow or Manchester or whatever, one of my big concerns would be getting public transport to work. And I think that it would be really important for employers to also, do they make sure that, you know, we're starting later so that people can, you know, walk or bike or whatever as well. So I think that that would be important. What could employers do in terms of like physical space in the office? Because obviously we're going to have all these social distancing rules for quite like some more time, and there's a lot of, you know, open plan offices where there's loads of people, maybe up to hundreds of people in the same office space, and that's going to cause a lot of anxiety. So what are the practical physical things that employers can implement into the offices?
I would think it's probably about having that staggered working, so that people can come in at different times and have that space. I think what will be important as well is that there's some facility for people having downtime in a socially distanced way. Now, I think there are particularly smaller organisations probably don't have staff rooms or coffee rooms or kitchens. So you might want to create turn a meeting room into a downtime room, a downturn room, whatever you call it, a timeout room.
Yeah, like a relaxation place.
Like a relaxation place, where again you'd have that literature around, even in everyday settings, in terms of having more psychologically and trauma-informed workplaces. You know, we've introduced jigsaw puzzles, mindfulness colouring, books. In some organisations I worked in, we've had signs up saying, you know, this is a work-free zone. Between the hours of 12:30 and 2:30, no work chat. So you're actually saying, and you might also have to want to say, you know, between the hours of 12 and 1, no COVID chat. You know, there might be ways of containing that to actually create space and give people permission. So I think the other thing is we have to acknowledge is that there might be a little bit of understandable irritation and what should we call annoyance if people are going back to work and they're not able to then use their non-work time for the things that they enjoy. So to go from your home bubble with its constraints in a constrained fashion to a work bubble with constraints is really, really difficult, because that makes it feel... I've already heard a lot of people saying that, you know, so I'm allowed to go to work, but I'm not allowed to see my grandchild. And a lot of people are saying that kind of thing. I can go to work, but I can't spend the money I earn on going to a concert that I've wanted to go to. So it's how we incorporate that. Now, we've got a certain amount of personal responsibility for that. So that might be saying, you know what, I'm going back to work, so I'm going to buy myself a new pair of shoes, or I'm going to buy myself a record that I wanted for ages, or I'm going to treat myself to a special food that I wouldn't normally get myself. But also from the employer's point of view, it might be that actually those treats are built into work time. So it might be about you know, getting a delivery of some special snack food or something, or I don't want to tell businesses what to do specifically, but finding some way of introducing something that acknowledges that people are putting their own personal, private enjoyments are not being considered in coming to work. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think that we're kind of facing, we're really staring into the unknown at the moment. And I think what you've said is really, you know, really practical tips. I just want to ask a fairly personal question. I'm finding that a lot of my peers are really resisting admitting that they're struggling because they can see that they are privileged in lots of ways in their situation. You know, a lot of them are financially stable, have a home, can see some family members and, you know, have their health. And they keep saying, you know, I don't have it that bad. But could that actually be harmful for people not acknowledging that they are going through a trauma as well? And can it actually get in the way of the process of healing?
No, it is part of that normal process. You know, we had talked before in terms of bereavement reactions that guilt's normal. When people go through trauma, we have what we call survivor guilt. Now, if people have been involved in major trauma like bombings, hijackings, major trauma, lots of the people who come out feel very guilty that they have survived and that people that they know or even don't know haven't. So that survivor guilt is very much part of it. So a little bit of guilt is about avoiding these feelings. Now, it's a tough one because we want to acknowledge that some people have got it far worse than we do. I am so appreciative of the fact that, I've got, a large enough house, that I have access to my family through these means, through phones and so on, that I've been able to afford a computer, that I've got a garden I can go in, a dog I can walk. I'm so appreciative of that. And I really feel very, very strongly for people who are, say, in a high-rise block with young children, or dealing with sheltering when they're not able, they haven't got their own personal space to go out and walk in. So that it's not negating the reality of other people's experiences. But if I avoid my own distress by not validating it, by saying I can't possibly feel bad because I've not got as bad as somebody else, I haven't got it as bad as somebody else has it, then actually that's moving into the avoidance and the invalidating of our own feelings.
Yeah.
So again, it's about saying, I feel pretty bad. I know people have got it far worse, but I still feel pretty bad.
Yeah. And, do you think it is possible to heal from this trauma that we're going through? And if so, is it possible to ever completely, erase things like depression and mood swings and anxiety? Or, as you said, is it just you just have to deal with them to process it? Does that make sense? In order to heal?
Absolutely. We do need to process it, and we process things by talking them through.
Yeah.
By thinking them, by changing their meaning. Somebody who has flashbacks, say, to a trauma, hasn't processed it. It stays in the here and now. And we process it by learning to manage the feelings and learning to think it through so it goes into our memory banks. With this situation, this is most definitely something we can get through. We can also we can be building our resilience, both at an organisational and individual level during this time. But we also have to acknowledge that being down and being anxious is something that is going to happen to all of us at some point in our lives. And if people have had a history of more chronic levels of anxiety or low mood, then it's important to remember that will be with them at times throughout their lives. It's a bit like having, I had a knee injury years and years ago. So if I overstretch it, it hurts, and I need to go back and look after it again. It's the same if you've had some kind of mental health problems. If there are lots and lots of demands around in your world, if there's demands at work, demands within the family, that's going to be somebody's vulnerability. They're going to be anxious again. They're going to be down again. That's going to be, and it's a case of thinking, right, okay, I'm down at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look after myself. I'm going to do all that self-care stuff because I know I can come out of it the other end. What's not helpful is when people think, oh my God, here it goes again, and withdraw and think this is it forever. Our moods are always temporary. They might be temporary for some longer periods than others, but they're never a permanent state.
And is there any, I know we have to, just sit within them and just know that they're going to end, but is there any tips that you would have that if you wanted to try and at least try and get rid of them, what are those kind of top tips that help us move through these times?
There are lots and lots of organisations out there. Lots of organisations that work on a voluntary capacity. There's there's mental health organisations, there's breathing space, there's Samaritans when things get really bad. There are lots and lots of organisations. If it gets to the point where it's particularly difficult, and if it's gone on for 2-3 months and people's levels of anxiety or low mood or experience of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, if it goes on for 2-3 months and it's significantly interfering with your ability to work, to socialise, to interact with your family, if it gets to the point where for weeks on end you can't get out of bed or you can't eat or you can't sleep, then the thing to do is to go to your GP. And certainly here in Scotland, GPs have got access to online courses. which can be done. There are lots of therapists out there who can work with you. There are therapists available through the NHS, primary care psychologists. There are lots of people out there. So when it gets really bad, there are definitely organisations to help. But there are things that we can do ourselves beforehand to help us to, one, recognise and accept that these are the feelings, and think about how we can take very small steps, baby steps, to build up our confidence, to build up a management of our mood. Because when it's really bad, being able to get out of bed, get showered, get something to eat, and even then just sit down in the front of the telly again, that's often a really big achievement. So it's about setting small, manageable goals, but knowing that there are people out there, organisations, professionals who are in a position to help, is absolutely key to us being aware that this is a normal problem, and people shouldn't be scared to acknowledge it.
Yeah. I think that's something that we're kind of always told, all these kind of steps of what we can do. But sometimes I think that we bury it and then we only really hear when we need it, if that makes sense. So I hope that anyone listening just now that feels, has been feeling down and has been feeling like it's hard to get out of bed, I hope that, this is a comfort for you to know that you're not alone, and that, we are facing this globally at the moment, and there are people out there that want to help and are experts in helping. I want to talk a little bit about resilience, because I know that that's obviously our tagline for the podcast, and it's a really important word for you and a word that you use all the time in your work. And I'm a poet and I'm obsessed with why people use certain words. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the word and what it means to you and your practice.
Yeah, in terms of my sort of clinical work and my understanding of the field, it was a term that's used often more in terms of young people and children, as you'll know from your work, Leyla. It's used a lot in terms of building resilience. I think I like the word because it gives, I always think in my mind's eye, I always have an image of a kind of elastic band.
Yeah.
Or a rubber ball that has the ability to tolerate stress but can bounce back. So I think I like that word better than coping, because coping implies a kind of something that you pull out at times of need, whereas resilience is something that's there all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I like the word from that point of view, and I think it's also coping also has a negative of not coping.
Yeah.
So it's unhelpful coping. It doesn't necessarily mean, it's not necessarily a positive word, but I think to me resilience is quite a positive word. I don't know from your point of view as a wordsmith, if you would agree.
I think that there's something about there's a kind of feeling of strength in it. It's like, makes me think of athletes building resilience, that kind of thing. And also obviously the at the start kind of makes you think of like replay and repeat, and this idea that to keep going and to keep trying. So I think that that's a really nice way to think about it as well. Another word that I'm absolutely obsessed with is hope. Hope is probably one of my favorite words, and I don't know if you've ever read Rebecca Solnit, who's an author who writes about kind of global events and kind of natural disasters and what happens in the communities after this happens. And she's got this book called Hope in the Dark, which is a reflection. It was written at the time of the Iraq War. And it's a reflection on what happens when there's a lot of fear throughout communities, and how people tend to come together to really make positive differences within their communities. And one of the quotes that she uses in it is, she says that hope is not a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky with. It is the axe that you batter down doors with. And I love the idea of hope has to be like an action rather than like a passive feeling, which is more like optimism. And I was just wondering, what role does hope have for us at this time? I know this is quite a difficult question, but what role does hope have in hopefully healing as individuals, but also as a society?
I love that quote. I think for me, hope is also about having that sense of mastery. and that sense of autonomy, that we have some control over what our hopes are. So we can start making small plans to realise those hopes. I think as well what we have to look back on, and again this is linked to both hope and resilience. If we look back on our lives, we'll see that we have been able to overcome difficulties in the past. Lots of our most vulnerable people in the community manage things that I would struggle with managing. So I've worked a lot with people who've been homeless, who've been persistent offenders, who've had substance misuse problems. And if I were to be, put in the circumstances in which they are, I would struggle. So people have always coped with something. And I think your hope and your plans for the future, which are tied to hope, are very much caught up in that, able to look back on your life and think, actually, there's some things I've managed really well.
I feel like we're all going to look back and it's going to be a really important time for us all, a time that we learned some really difficult lessons, and we really had to have a good look at who we are as individuals and what we rely on, and also who we are as a society and what our values are. That's my kind of hope. I hope that we manage to really reflect and make some really positive changes from what has been a little bit of a mess, really.
Absolutely, and I think if part of that is people listening into this and thinking, actually, you know what, I've learned more about this through COVID. I've learned more about mental health and how I can perhaps support myself, my family, my work colleagues, my employees. If people have done that, then that to me gives me some kind of hope that we can come out of this as a more enlightened and rounded society.
I think that's a lovely place to end on. So thank you so much, Anne.
Thanks, Leyla. Take care.